Welcome, fellow plebs. My name is Sean, and this is
Tribunus Plebis.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. So today, I want to talk about philanthropy. Now, what kind of a jerk is going to argue against philanthropy? Well, I guess it's me. And let me throw a loose definition out there first, then I will defend my stance. When I say philanthropy, I am speaking specifically about the phenomenon of wealthy people creating foundations and the like in an attempt to help fix or mitigate some form of usually systemic problems and issues, as well as a more general flooding of the charitable political, landscape with money by these same wealthy people, all in an effort to avoid taxes and to influence public policy. While I believe that many of these people are very likely intending to make real attempts to fix real problems, they are missing the mark more often than not. And when it comes to the truly and spectacularly wealthy and powerful, they aren't even trying to help. They are trying to manipulate. Philanthropy should not be used interchangeably with charity. The difference here in the most charitable, applause for the pun, I guess, the most charitable sense is the difference between, giving a man a fish, charity, and teaching a man to fish, philanthropy. Philanthropy is focused on repairing core issues, root issues, teaching the hungry to fish. Charity is an attempt to alleviate pain in a more immediate fashion, more direct fashion, feeding the hungry, giving the man a fish. I wanted to make that distinction to make myself a little bit more clear. Both charity and philanthropy, if pursued in a vacuum and with good intentions, are noble pursuits. I myself have made charitable efforts, helping cook and serve food at a soup kitchen, collecting food, purchasing many, many pairs of socks for the homeless, making donations, and even giving money to people on the street and so on. So why are these wealthy folks so often missing the mark with philanthropy? Or, well, you know what, maybe not missing the mark, but why are they shooting at an entirely different target than we assume that they're aiming for? My argument is self-preservation. They are literally preserving their status and their power. After all, to truly fix these problems they claim to focus on, the rich would have to deal with themselves, the real problem, and possibly not in a very pleasant way. When the core root problem is systemic class oppression, any attempt by the elite class to alleviate the pain of the subjugated is to cede power, and this is, to state the obvious, not their goal. To celebrate giving a pittance to the very same people you have extracted wealth from is to entirely miss your own reality. If I have taken 90% from someone, leaving them destitute and emotionally broken, and I give them 10% of what I have taken back, I am no hero. I'm not even decent. What I have done is unethical and immoral. But I am very likely to, look at my charitable donation of that 10% as a real step forward for that poor person, all the while not recognizing that while I may have dulled the pain for a few short moments, pain which I have actually caused in the first place, I have done nothing to strike at the core of the problem, which would be myself in this case. I am trying to blunt a cruelty that I have perpetrated with a pat on the head and without ever recognizing that I am, in fact, perpetrating a cruelty. The blindness in this perspective is nearly as obvious as it is unforgivable. Charity in these instances is self-preservation, a literal buffer to pitchfork mobs and revolution. Keep the poor and miserable just happy enough to not light their torches and mob the gates to the McMansion suburbs and, the True Mansion enclaves. As Mark Blythe likes to say, the Hamptons are not a defensible position. And hello there, everybody. As most of you probably know, this podcast takes a lot of time and effort to put together and, to get out there for you good folks to listen to. And you, our listeners, can help us by liking and subscribing on YouTube. So please take a second to click those little buttons. It helps a ton. And if you are feeling just a little bit more generous and you enjoy what we do here at Tribunus Plebis Media, you can help us earn just a little bit of money for the large amount of labor that we put into this thing by signing up on our Buy Me a Coffee page, where you can make a one-time donation or sign up for a recurring monthly subscription. We do all of this for free, and we will never run ads in our works. But any contributions really do help keep the show going and improving. The page address is buymeacoffee.com/Tribunus Plebis. And of course, all links will be in the show notes and descriptions wherever you are listening or watching. Thank you. And now, back to the episode. The word philanthropy evokes visions of mega-wealthy donors lavishing their excesses upon charities who then help the poor and unfortunate or cure a stubbornly pernicious disease. Rarely do we think of philanthropy as a method of control or an exercise in power. To be fair, donors themselves typically view their gifts as being entirely of the former variety. They enter into their philanthropic endeavors with aplomb. Direct giving, endowments, and even foundations meant to live in perpetuity, think the Gates Foundation or Rockefeller Foundation, which by the way is now on its 6th generation of Rockefeller leadership, and they imbue these foundations with the noble goal of eradicating this issue or curing that disease and so on. Ballrooms all around the country, but predominantly in the larger cities like New York and Los Angeles or Chicago in particular, are full of men and women. Each of these human beings is worth hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars. Some even tens of billions, some hundreds of billions. They are paying $10,000 a plate for meals prepared by world-famous chefs running Michelin-starred kitchens, and the guests will cut checks for tens of thousands of dollars more throughout the night, if not for hundreds of thousands. They will then pat each other on the back, shake each other's hands, and go home happy that they have lessened the pain of the working poor, or cured that particular medical scourge, or empowered some minority. And to be fair, again, these huge gifts actually do some good in the world. Research centers receive funds to find cures for everything from breast cancer to malaria, and even may improve problems such as food deserts and clean water issues. And they help alleviate issues for every cause in between, the few I mentioned. Everything is very clear and calm on its surface, but as we all know, still waters run deep, and in those depths we find currents. What we discover about those currents is that they run in the wrong direction, and they stir up mud. And I want to be clear about something here. This episode is not an attempt to slander those who give, and they do give generously by almost anyone's standards. This episode is about power. It's about power, influence, clout, and how these things are inextricably connected to the philanthropic giving of the most wealthy people in this country. And this worry is definitely not something which is new. When the Rockefeller Foundation was created in the early 20th century, there was a ton of criticism in this vein. The Rockefeller Foundation was, quote, an indefinite scheme for perpetuating vast wealth, end quote. And it was, quote, entirely inconsistent with public interest, end quote. A U.S. official criticized such organizations as, quote, a menace to the welfare of society, end quote. And what I think most of us understand is the power the wealthy wield over our society and government. And I am including corporations and corporate giving here, along with individuals and families. Wealthy donors, especially private donors, are the most powerful social engineers in the country. The actual levers they can pull are often in plain sight. Think, congressional representatives, senators, political parties, and lower levels of government at the city and state level. We see these levers. We watch them move, but we almost never actually see the physical hands that are pushing and pulling them. These hands are hidden, much like Oz, behind a curtain. In the case of Oz, it was a physical barrier, an actual piece of fabric. For philanthropic donors, that curtain is much more layered and opaque. Here's an example of what I mean. A wealthy family gives $1 million to a charity run by Senator Smith's family. That charity gives $500,000 to the National Political Party. The National Political Party gives $200,000 to a Washington, D.C. think tank. The think tank then distributes $150,000 to 15 or so former congressmen and congressional aides to influence their representatives and senators. Senator Smith then proposes a seemingly unrelated bill, and all of those influenced congressmen vote yes. The lever got pulled and the machinery moved, and it had the desired outcome. Senator Smith's bill is now law. The philanthropist pulled the lever behind the curtain, and the public was only aware of those last two steps usually. The bill proposal and the vote. And everything seems legit and not corrupt because most of us simply don't have the time or the inclination to dig 5 or more layers deep to understand what is happening. The dots do exist. It's the connecting them that is so hard. And if we do follow them, they all, or most anyway, lead back to the same source: philanthropic giving. What's disturbing about a lot of this giving is the power it has the potential to wield over the mass of people who live in this country. The wealthy are not happy simply controlling the government. They are building think tanks to push their own personal philosophy upon the rest of us. As an example, for anyone who is skeptical about this whole idea that the wealthy are using philanthropy under the guise of both the banal and the obviously good, like curing diseases, to actually control society, I want to point to a very recent example exactly like this. Barry Said, a generally unknown, ultra-conservative Chicago businessman, recently donated his entire company, called Triplight, to the newly minted charitable organization called Marble Freedom Trust, which was headed by Leonard Leo, former president of and current co-chair of the conservative Federalist Society. Marble Freedom Trust then took this donated company and sold it to Eaton Corporation for $1.65 billion. Basically, Said quietly donated $1.65 billion to the Federalist Society in what amounts to one of the largest single donations to an explicitly political think tank in all of history. Also, I do want to really point out that this connection wasn't necessarily obvious either, and they never really are. Said donated a business to what amounts to a charity which was purpose-built for this singular donation. It was done this way to hide what was going on. To any outside viewer, they didn't even see any of this happening because it was all done anonymously. It would have been essentially impossible to see it as a normal citizen. Thankfully, some investigative journalists at CNN and the New York Times managed to dig the information up, which is, really one of the few remaining reasons to look at massive news outlets like this with any sense of belief. Small independent media usually just does not have, the funds and the resources to dig some things up. Anyway, the Federalist Society is, essentially nothing more than an ultra-conservative, very right-wing organization which is devoted to finding young, conservative lawyers and guiding their careers. And by guiding, I mean literally telling them what to do, think, and say. Literally, like in the actual definition of that word. And then leading them to positions of power in the state and federal governments. When Donald Trump said that he had a list of conservative justices to potentially nominate to the Supreme Court, that list was written by the Federalist Society. And then it was handed to him. And he definitely, allegedly, got a stern warning from the kingmakers in that group to make sure he didn't stray from that list. And he didn't. This incredible donation and the think tank involved is just one example of how philanthropy works for political power. Whether these think tanks and NGOs are right-wing and conservative, as the majority are, or left-wing and liberal, there is an important bit of reality at play here. The wealthy are getting what they want. This sort of Trojan horse-style attack also removes another key element from the discourse: accountability. As a further bit of food for thought here, consider that a person with an open checkbook connected to a large bank account will be seriously listened to with little regard for whether their ideas are actually deserving of serious consideration or not. Conversely, poor people are rarely heard, as they do not have enough money to exert influence directly, nor to gain the ears of those with power, regardless of how good their ideas are. And, allow me a tangent here. Poverty is, as the world exists right now, simply a fact of life. It exists. Poverty is also something which a wealthy person can actually do something about, at least on a small scale and definitely on the individual basis. They could see somebody living an impoverished life, cut one check, and materially change that person's entire trajectory through the rest of their life. Inequality is something else. It is systemic. It is inherent in the system. In our country, the United States where I live, money equals power. It's encoded in law. Other things can equal power as well, but money is certainly a huge factor and probably the lever that is most available to people on average. And by that I mean, nepotism is another path to power. But being born into the Bush family isn't something that, anybody but a Bush can do, right? But money can be gathered and applied a little more, fairly? That's not the right word. I'm lost for the proper word right now, but I think you'll understand what I mean. So moving on, this economic income and wealth inequality means that the wealthy have power and the poor don't. One group of people have no power, and the other, much, much smaller group has all the power. Regular people being further pushed into the gutters. A 2008 study called Unequal Democracy shows that the bottom 33% of the income bracket has 0.0% effect on government policy. Billionaire serial philanthropist and former presidential candidate Mike Bloomberg said this in a 2015 interview about how philanthropy manipulates governments. Quote, "Governments have the authority to drive change in a way that philanthropic organizations cannot. By leveraging our resources, forming partnerships with government, philanthropic organizations can help push these changes forward." End quote. Here's another example. Bill Gates. Gates wants to remake education in the United States and the world. How many of you are familiar with Common Core standards of education? It's the stuff like, the new way to do math that people get annoyed with sometimes. You know where that came from? It came from Bill Gates spending hundreds of $millions to create it and hundreds of millions more to lobby lawmakers to force it upon the citizens. Now, to be honest, I don't know much about Common Core, so I'm not going to rant about it either way. I don't have children. I never see it, so I'm just going to, move on past that. The point here is just to say that the very reason why so many schools use Common Core is because of the philanthropic efforts of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to pump millions of dollars into senators' pockets. Bill Gates changed education in this country because he simply wanted to. He's not a teacher. He's not an educator. He's just wealthy and decided alone that the children of this country needed to learn things a new and different way, and then he, alone, made that happen through his philanthropy. And here's one of the primary hinge points I'll hit on. The insanely wealthy people like Bloomberg, Gates, and, their fellow ultra-wealthy elites do not want the same things that you or I want or need. The wants, needs, and wishes of the supremely wealthy are fundamentally, demonstrably, and irrevocably not the same as the wants, needs, and wishes of the other 99.9% of this country. yes, the goals of the wealthy really are that different from the rest of us. It should also be said that the wants of the rich are not any more important than those of the poor. It's sad that this has to be noted at all, let alone explicitly stated. But we live in a world where internet dum-dums actually think Elon Musk is a genius and that every insane idea of his is worth people dying for. Or monkeys being tortured for in the case of his ridiculous brain mesh nonsense. These dorks think tunnels are revolutionary in the 2020s, for Christ's sake. These billionaires also use philanthropy and the good press which it generates to wash their reputations. They use it to focus the public's attention on the supposed good of the giving and to pull that focus away from the unethical, immoral, and oftentimes just straight up illegal and horrific ways in which these fortunes were acquired. When talking about Rockefeller, who we mentioned earlier, Teddy Roosevelt said this, quote, "No amount of charities in spending such fortunes can compensate in any way for the misconduct in acquiring them." End quote. Let's further drive that last point home by noting that anybody can give and anybody can create a foundation to push any idea they want. No gatekeeping is good in some cases, and in other cases, it can be horrific. When foundation creators and massive givers have no qualifications or expertise beyond rote ideology, the odds that they will create anything but harm shrinks massively. Hell, we have ultra-successful billionaires who received welfare as children, learned in public schools, got grants and handouts to make it through school, used free libraries and so forth, and they still believe in Ayn Rand. Sure, these people are intelligent to some extent, but it doesn't make them wise. This sort of argument that the wealthy are the best people to decide what shall be done is really embodied in what is, in a lot of ways, the sort of Magna Carta of philanthropic thought. An essay written by Andrew Carnegie entitled The Gospel of Wealth. The concepts Carnegie lays out here are very similar to the giving pledge that many modern billionaires have signed, saying that they will give away huge portions of their fortunes, or even all of their fortunes in some cases. In this article, Carnegie makes a case that society should allow the wealthy to gather their fortunes in as free a way as possible and not hinder them. In return, the wealthy shall, once they have become incredibly wealthy, use their fortune to help those whom they took this wealth from in the first place. As for the essay, I don't want to read the entire thing. It's fairly long, but that really is the gist of it. Let fortune accumulate. Let the wealthy give it away as they see fit to heal the wounds that they created gathering their fortune. And behind this thought is the even older concept of noblesse oblige, if I said that right. It means nobility obliges, and is meant to mean that nobility has a certain ethical responsibility to take care of those beneath them. One of the main reasons why I don't think that this is a great ethical framework here is that the very concepts of the gospel of wealth and noblesse oblige rely on the presupposition that the wealthy, the nobility, are somehow justified to, 1, be in such a position in the first place, and 2, that their being in this position somehow justifies the decisions which they make to use their fortunes to affect our lives. It's like a circular reinforcement of the status quo more than a viable ethical and moral framework. It's an a priori argument, I think, if I'm using that right. To compound the problems that these differences in agenda create, the wealthy are giving in such quantity that it is further drowning out the voices of the poor and the less powerful. In Gilded Giving, which analyzed data from 2003 to 2013, the authors show that by studying tax data, they can show just how wide this disparity of giving has become. And by the way, if anybody has more recent info, I'd love it if you sent it to me. I couldn't find anything. Twitter, as always, is @TribunusMedia. Anyway, from the Gilded Giving Report. Quote, itemized charitable contributions from people making $500,000 or more, roughly the top 1% of income earners in the United States, increased by 57%. And itemized contributions from people making $10 million or more increased by almost double that rate, 104% over the same period. End quote. At the same time, charitable giving from those making under $100,000 has dropped by 34%, according to the same report. Also notable is that despite good work being done, we as a society will never be able to truly understand exactly who is giving money and where it is going, and we certainly won't be able to fathom either the vast amounts of wealth being secretly funneled across the political and social landscape or the net effect it will have in those realms. I will note here that the largest single recipient of quote-unquote charity in the United States is religion. I'm intentionally leaving out this entire category for multiple reasons, but even here, the same basic issues exist. Only about 5% of religious charity is used to directly help the needy. So where is the rest going? It's going to create and reinforce power, influence, status, and profit. It is put towards moving a particular agenda forward, a conservative religious agenda, much like what I'm speaking about here more generally. So massive wealth inequality, stagnant incomes, rising tax burden, and the general inequalities these issues represent in most of our lives has caused charitable giving to become a top-heavy behemoth supported by the mega wealthy that does not have, in my opinion at least, the common people's interest at heart. As mentioned previously, the largest and most well-funded think tanks in the country are conservative in nature. With this size and wealth comes an immense amount of influence and power. Organizations like the American Enterprise Institute, Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute, ALEC, and Rand Corporation are major recipients of philanthropic largesse. And these think tanks and hundreds of others act as Trojan horses to carry into society the changes that these philanthropists want. By doing this, by slipping harmful legislation and policy past the gates of checks and balances, they undermine democratic ideals and, in fact, they undermine society itself. A lot of people do not connect think tanks to philanthropy, but nearly all of them are funded by this method, and many of the billionaire gives X amount of millions of dollars to charity headlines are talking about this form of sometimes indirect giving rather than the implied action of saving the children. This is yet another form of media whitewashing of shitty behavior by the powerful. They might not directly lie to you about where the money is going, but they aren't clear about it either, and absolutely intentionally allow "gave to charity" in their headlines to imply that the money went to buy crippled children leg braces or something, when it actually went to ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is probably, almost definitely, currently drafting copy and paste legislation to end gay marriage in this country. Conservative think tanks exert an enormous amount of influence upon lawmakers. Their major messages are smaller government, lower taxes, particularly on corporations and the massively wealthy who are actually doing all of this donating, defense spending, free market economics, and other neoliberal and conservative viewpoints. Liberal think tanks, though they push a different agenda, behave in the exact same method, but are less influential usually, and fewer in number as well as being less well-funded. I don't exclude them to dismiss their behavior. They aren't in the end much different, to be honest. Liberalism is just slightly less garbage conservatism at the end of the day. The wealthy influence the government through the charity that they send through these think tanks. The think tanks influence the government. So, on this end, the wealthy are supporting lawmakers. They are indoctrinating new or up-and-coming lawmakers. And they are getting their agendas codified into law and policy of the United States through courts which are controlled by Federalist Society-curated conservative goons. Social programs are being actively eroded. The wealth of the bottom 95% of the country is remaining stagnant at best and falling for those at the bottom of the ladder. The following is from the National Bureau of Economic Research paper called Tax-Exempt Lobbying: Corporate Philanthropy as a Tool for Political Influence. Quote, "Our analysis suggests that firms deploy their charitable foundations as a form of tax-exempt influence seeking. Based on a straightforward model of political influence, our estimates imply that 7.1% of total U.S. corporate charitable giving is politically motivated, an amount that is economically significant. It is 280% larger than annual PAC contributions and about 40% of total federal lobbying expenditures. Given the lack of formal electoral or regulatory disclosure requirements, charitable giving may be a form of political influence that goes mostly undetected by voters and shareholders, and which is directly subsidized by taxpayers." End quote. Okay, so here's the next step in philanthropy's takeover plan: to take over control. As these conservative philanthropists destroy the government and the social programs that it runs and negatively impact the wealth of the middle class and poor, not to mention their experiences in local and state society, they step in with another level of philanthropy. The wealthy begin to both directly and indirectly fund social programs, public schools, and even soup kitchens. They purposefully destroy public education, they use their influence to directly cut school budgets, and they use the officials which the Federalist Society elevates into power to indirectly do the same, and then say, "Hey, we'll pay for your education, join us." They systematically destroy public housing and then buy all of the land and property and housing and say, "Hey, rent from us." They choose to destroy public transport from the inside out, cut bus routes, remove subway trains, and remove bus stop shelters, and then say, "Hey, I'll dig a tunnel you can use for a higher fee." Do we see how pervasive and invasive all of this is? By controlling the government through this sort of soft corruption, they weaken and destroy the government from within. As the government falters, the wealthy step in and, quote-unquote, donate funds to keep programs going as private endeavors, or they simply start new ones from whole cloth as replacements. These new programs are not simply fill-ins for failing institutions. They are propaganda programs as well. The mega-wealthy are controlling and influencing at both ends of the spectrum now. From the top and from the bottom and from both extreme wings of this control, they are pushing towards the conservative right. This is the oligarchy. This is the plutocracy. This is the corporatocracy. This is the dystopian nightmare. To further add insult to injury, please keep in mind that all of this money that is being donated is tax deductible. It's a convenient way for the wealthy to further shirk their tax responsibilities, which then puts further pressure on the working and lower classes, and it reduces the funding for government programs even further. It's a very convenient, self-perpetuating cycle that furthers the interest of the wealthy and powerful, harms the poor, and increases in already catastrophic wealth and access inequality. On a lower, more civic level, these donors are literally shaping the cities and towns we live in. They are deciding which schools stay open, who runs them, how they're run, and what's taught within them. We see this with the current anti-trans, anti-gay, and pro-religious indoctrination laws that we see being passed. along with book bannings and the anti-free speech, anti-BDS agreement government workers must sign, including teachers. They finance and pull financing from projects that they like or do not like. They get the tax laws changed to reduce their own taxes and increase yours, or at the very least, leaves a gap in funding which they can exploit. Even when great wealth tries to help a city or town out of pure kindness, we cannot forget that this kindness is still driven by the wants and needs of the wealthy, not the common man, not the citizens of these cities and towns, and it is also very likely guided by some sort of dogmatic drive. Many of these billionaires have pledged to give away their entire fortunes or close to it in the case of those with children. And we should believe them. They very likely will give it all away. What we should be concerned with is just how this great wealth will be given away and why. It is my view that this great giveaway of these massive fortunes is incredibly self-serving. They look good to the outside world, yeah, sure, okay. The donators, the powerful, the repressors, they feel good in their mansions and yachts. The reality, it seems to me, is that these people are swinging haphazardly at branches while purposefully ignoring the roots, no matter how selfless they may believe that they are. The truth is that all of this charity is merely a balm, a soothing of some of the great pain of the world. This balm is problematic because its very application is both, not letting the wound heal, but also allowing newer, more raw ones to open. These new wounds will be treated the same way, and the cycle will continue. The result, at the end of the day, is a net negative. The medicine in this case is worse than the sickness. This is poison to a democratic society. Without proper accountability and clarity, philanthropy at this level will continue to maintain and increase the power and influence of the already rich and powerful. This giving will continue to erode government spending and lead to austerity measures. This, in turn, will help further solidify the plutocratic class atop our country. And if you've made it this far and you're thinking, well, what the hell do we do here? I understand. And we could start with, simply taxing the insanely wealthy. It's wild as hell that people resist this. Fund the government programs so that there is no opening for these terrible people to step in and privatize them. Right? Even Carnegie was in favor of progressive taxation and estate taxes under the belief that it would encourage more philanthropy. Tribunus Plebis, however, feels that these fortunes should never be amassed in the first place. The extremely wealthy do not give to help society as a whole. They give, even if subliminally, to preserve their own station. They give to keep their wealth, power, and influence. They give to preserve this pseudo-caste system which they reign over. They give to maintain a socio-economic system which benefits them, a system which concentrates power at the top and takes the power and voice of the very people they claim to want to help. Most importantly, they give to keep our pitchforks in our sheds, to dull our pain just enough, just barely enough, to convince us to go kindly, blindly about our days. They are willing to do nearly anything, so long as that something does not actually address the root causes of the common man's pain, and quite especially, they do not ever do anything that threatens the wealth, status, and power of themselves or their friends. And if the wealthy are not willing to cede ground in those areas, then nothing they do with their money, no matter how much they give to any number of programs, no matter how good-hearted and well-intended their actions, they will never do anything more than to dull the pain and keep our pitchforks in our tool sheds. That's it. That's the sum total of the best possible outcome. This is no answer. It's simply a maintenance of the status quo. This is the road to hearing Happy Hunger Games, and may the odds be ever in your favor for generations to come. And that, my friends, is the end of the episode. I hope you liked it. If you enjoy what we do here at Tribunus Plebis Media, please consider liking, subscribing wherever you are. Leave a comment. Let us know what you think. We have a Buy Me a Coffee page at buymeacoffee.com/TribunusPlebis, please. If you have a couple bucks a month, for as little as $3 a month, you can subscribe to a monthly subscription and really help us out. Or you can make a one-time donation. The links are all in the description here. And I think that's it. I guess maybe it's a little bit of a longer episode. I thank you guys for hanging out. Yeah, that's it. I'll see you next time. I love you all. Bye.